Hi, I'm Jim Brayshaw, and today I'm going to talk about the temptation of Christ in the wilderness. He was supposedly sent into the wilderness, was tempted by Satan himself, we're told, and was almost drawn over to the dark side, if only he would have bowed down to worship Satan. I guarantee you, if we look at this from a cultural perspective, take into account the ancient understanding of what a Satan and a devil or diabolos is, we're going to see that no, there was no devil hanging around with Jesus while he was fasting, trying to be spiritual in the wilderness for 40 days. Right off the bat, in Matthew 4, we see that Jesus Christ, Yeshua, was led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the diabolos. It says the devil in the English language, and we're going to talk about that for a minute. And then it says when he was fasted 40 days and 40 nights, afterward he was hungry. So then he goes and spent this 40 days in the wilderness. Then afterward, two of the Gospels actually indicate it was after the 40 days that he was hungry when this interesting testing or tempting came to him. Because the next verse says, and when the tempter came to him, he said, this is what the tempter said, if you are the Son of God, make these stones become bread. Obviously he was hungry. And the tempter knew that Christ could do a miracle. But who was the tempter? I'm going to give it to you in a short nutshell here. One of the interesting aspects of this tale is that right before the Spirit sends Jesus into the wilderness to be tempted or tested by this diabolos, we found he was at the River Jordan getting baptized by John. And who was on shore watching the baptism? Well, it was the Scribes and Pharisees, and we know they were a jealous brood. So they just witnessed this display of an anointed action over a man who's being claimed to be a great leader at least and the Messiah at most, and now they're standing there jealously watching. So they decided when he went into the wilderness, hey, we've got to go chase this guy down and check it out and see if he's the Messiah. We need to go test it and see if his claims are true, see if those claims are true. So the tempting in the wilderness was a tempting by jealous men. When Christ was hanging around his culture in the Aramaic society, if a man was about to embark on a very significant spiritual or political journey, often he would go spend time in the wilderness, away from the city, to contemplate. And it was the unction inside a person, which is really what a spirit is in this case, was leading them to go do that. They felt this is important for me to go really become introspective as I prepare for this next stage in my journey and my mission. And so Yeshua, Jesus, went into the wilderness to contemplate. After he was done his 40-day fast, he was now tested by who? The Pharisees and Scribes. Did you hear that? It wasn't Satan. Now the English language tells us it was the devil. And Satan is the reference there in all of our minds in this part of the world. But it wasn't. It was actually the Pharisees and Scribes. We see 9 times in the New Testament where the Scribes and Pharisees come to the Messiah and tempt him. The same word, prazo, is the Greek word that's used, and it means tested or tempted is the way it's translated in English often. But all it means is these guys were testing the Messiah. And there was, interestingly enough, in that period, there was a group of Pharisees, or rabbinic types, whose job it was to test messianic candidates. If you or I came along in that day and we were being hailed as a spiritual leader, perhaps the Messiah, then this group would come along and test this Messiah. They wanted to know if he fit their traits, if he could jump their hurdles, if he qualified by their standards to be the Messiah. Now, they didn't always use biblical standards, so here's where it kind of falls apart in Christian thinking, because we see some things going on here that we think only the devil could do. So what we see first when these Scribes and Pharisees decide to come and test the Messiah candidate is we see they tell him, hey, if you're the Son of God, turn these stones to bread. Now, what we often forget to do is ask, why would they do this? Well, interesting, we can unearth some historical documents, some literature from the period, some of the Essenic documents, or even some of the rabbinic writings that show one of the rabbinic tests for the Messiah was if he could do a miracle such as turn stones to bread. If he could do so, then he would advance in their mind as a valid and viable candidate for Messiah. The next thing we see these tempters do, and not Satan, is take this Christ, it says, up to the pinnacle of the temple in the holy city. And they said to him, if you're the Son of God, cast yourself down. Everybody often says, well, Satan knows Scripture so well, so he even used it against Christ. But here we have the Pharisees, the rabbinic set, the testers for the Messiah, using Scripture to say, you know what? If you're the Son of God, you're the Messiah, you're going to be protected if you fire yourself off this high place, and you won't get hurt. And one of the ideas the rabbis, the rabbinic set had for the Messiah was if he could vault himself off a high building, pick the highest building in the background. If he were to vault himself off that building and live, they said, well, for sure this guy's the Messiah then. Would be one of their deciding factors. What was this Messiah candidate's response? What was Yeshua's response when he was asked to launch himself off a high building? It simply was, it's written again, don't test the Lord your God. He uses the same word parazzo, because I remind you, the testing that was going on occurs repeatedly to this guy throughout the entire New Testament. And then they asked him a question to test him, and then they came to him to tempt him, test him. The word parazzo means test, and it's not referring to the temptations that you and I have been told it refers to as coming from a satanic entity. It's referring to a testing coming from a man or a group of men. Well, the heat's getting to me. I'm just about melting, so I want to wrap up and say thank you for taking a look at this. I'm Jim Brayshaw, and please go to my website, imaginenosatan.com. You can find all 3 copies of my first 3 volumes there, and there you can see by looking at the free reading material on my site that there's lots of probability that there's no supernatural cosmic Satan to worry about. All we're dealing with is a human man is an adversary to another human man. A human man is an adversary to himself. A Satan or a Diablos is also a disease or an illness. It's also a false religious leader or a false religious idea or a false religion. A Satan or Sata or Satanas is also a governmental system that's oppressing a people, can be called a Satan. So keep poking your nose around. I think there's a lot for all of us to learn, but I would like to invite you again to just take a look at some of the material available and go have a listen to my blog talk radio show where I deal with all of these topics in a great discussion on there. Thanks so much. I'm Jim Brayshaw.